Vincent van Gogh's paintings would certainly be different had he not been piously educated as a Protestant and preacher. His letters are riddled with references to his belief, and it is no surprise to discover that Van Gogh, the former preacher, organised the perspective of his drawings according to his faith. We might add that his way of applying paint itself has something to do with the Protestant sanctification of work.
Now I'm going to introduce you to another aspect of Vincent van Gogh. I told you that he was very interested in trades. This was partly due to the Protestant tradition he was raised in, where the tradesman houses a chosen soul. Van Gogh, rather than asserting himself as an artisan painter, tended to identify with the most humble tradesmen and labourers that surrounded him, and in such a way he became, and this will be our first part, a humble weaver among other weavers. To Albert Aurea, one of the first critics to publicly recognise his talent, Van Gogh writes these words about a painting he proposed to give him. You will see that this constitutes more or less the combination of tones of those pretty Scottish checked cloths, green, blue, red, yellow, black, which once appeared so charming to you as they did to me, and which, alas, one scarcely sees any more these days. In other words, he regretted that the colourful checked fabrics that he called Scottish cloths have died out. He liked these Scottish cloths that he emulated through the colours, but I believe I can demonstrate, based on other paintings, that Van Gogh did indeed paint these Scottish tartans. Look at the potato eaters. First of all, what did he write about these potato eaters? I've had the threads of this fabric in my hands the whole winter long, he said, and searched for the definitive pattern. And if it's now a fabric that has a rough and coarse look, nevertheless the threads were chosen with care and in accordance with certain rules, and it might well prove to be a real peasant painting. We will return later to this real peasant painting, but for the time being, let's talk about the threads. I don't see a tapestry and am instead confronted by a painting that is rather grey. Yet he speaks about a fabric whose threads he had in his hands. Clearly he is drawing an analogy between his work as a painter and the work of a weaver. He was in Nuenen, Holland, among the 440 weavers that I told you about earlier on. For Van Gogh, the traces of paint, these strokes of paint, were threads because his work was that of a weaver. He identified with weavers and, through the analogy, he considered his work to be like that of a weaver. He was in Nuenen when he painted Loom with Weaver in 1884.
De 84 donc à Nuenen. Eh bien, je pense qu'il a positionné ce
I think he positioned this craftsman in a similar way to that of the artist in front of his frame. Look at his gaze and look at the threads. If I put the frame back in, the painter takes the place of the weaver. I'll move on to another painting, Weaver, seen from the front, from 84 again, set in Nuenen. This man is also behind a frame strung with threads, and then it seems curious to me that we can see so clearly the screws on either side of the loom. Once again, technology allows us to position the perspective frame directly on top. I am not claiming that the weaver is working with a perspective frame. What I am saying is that Van Gogh identifies with the weaver. One works with the loom and the other with the frame. The two structures resemble each other. Here we have another weaver. This time he signed it, writing his name directly onto the loom. Look at the position of the pencil. Well, it isn't a pencil, it's a shuttle, although the weaver is holding it vertically as if it were a pencil, just like this drawing by Albrecht Dürer. We therefore get the impression that he is drawing. You can't really see it, but in 84 and 85, Van Gogh studied Michel-Eugène Chevreul's law of simultaneous colour contrast. We have already spoken about the laws of colour contrast, according to which, when you want to emphasise colours and not extinguish them, you bring together colours that are opposites on the colour wheel.
sur le cercle chromatique. Le jaune avec un certain bleu, le
Orange yellow with blue, yellow with purple, red with green. Juxtaposing two complementary colours enhances them. And who wrote these lines with which all Impressionists worked, and the post-Impressionists even more so?
Post-impressionniste.
It was, of course, Chevreul. Who was Chevreul? He was a chemist, but most importantly, he was the director of the Gobelins tapestry factory. His weavers were practical. They chose a strand of yellow wool, and then they chose a green one. The yellow is magnificent, the green is splendid. They weave a carpet and suddenly the tapestry is drab. What happened? Well, they juxtaposed colours that cancelled each other out because they weren't complementary colours that were opposites on the colour wheel. So instead, they tried juxtaposing yellow with blue and so on. Van Gogh wasn't at the Gobelin tapestry factory, but he was among the weavers of Nuenen, who made very colourful fabrics known as bong, and at the time they produced a type of cloth with prominent colours.
Et à l'époque, on faisait une sorte de torchon avec des couleurs saillantes.
So Van Gogh, while not at the Gobelin tapestry factory, was nonetheless among the Nuenen workers who faced the same challenges. He put directly into practice the colour principles established by Chevreul and popularised by Blanc. He was the only one in his generation, all of whom were passionate about complementary colour theory and juxtaposition, who put these theories into practice in his own particular way. He wouldn't use paint to do so. He used threads of wool that he kept in a box, a Chinese writing case with red varnish. Here he stored his little balls of wool.
Cette petite boîte, c'est une boîte à thé laqué rouge japonaise dans laquelle il a mis ses petites pelotes.
Which are now somewhat faded and preserved at the Van Gogh Museum. He perhaps only acquired these balls of wool when he arrived in Paris. He tested his combinations in a practical way because he was still in a mode of total pragmatism. He tried out Chevreul's laws of contrast. I don't think that anyone else took the same approach, because no one else worked with a perspective frame, nor with these little balls of coloured wool. When Van Gogh was in Arles at the end of '88, he was under Paul Gauguin's influence and worked from memory. There he depicted his mother with his sisters, hence the title, Memory of the Garden at Etten. Etten being in Holland.
En Hollande. Et il décrit ce tableau en disant notre mère vous.
You will recognise Van Gogh's lines and colours. And when he described this painting to his sister, he commented that their mother was wrapped in a Scottish plaid. Well, I am somewhat struggling to see this Scottish plaid since I don't see them as checks. Personally, I think that he was first and foremost testing out the pointillism of his friends, Paul Signac and Georges Seurat, which must have horrified Gauguin, who was decidedly jealous of the pointillists.
Des pointillistes. Mais regardez plutôt, on va trouver des exemples de tapisseries véritables.
We must look elsewhere for concrete examples of tapestries in Van Gogh's work. Notice the background of this painting in which there is a real alternation between the green squares and the green vertical and horizontal lines. He is weaving the background of his canvas.
De sa toile.
It's the same thing here, although this time it is more saturated. You have green on green, but you can still make out the horizontal and vertical strokes of colour that are equivalent to a weave.
De tissage, et puis à nouveau un peu de toile sur la droite. Et puis là,
on the right is a bare canvas, and then, as proof of what I am saying, he decides to paint an extraordinary blue and black tartan. It looks like plaid in the background, while in the foreground the canvas is bare again.
Il utilise cette même technique.
He used this same technique for the ground of his olive trees. You have blue and red squares that are woven in the form of a Scottish plaid. We'll come back to the copies of Jean-François Millet that he produced. We can see a similar tapestry effect in Evening. If I zoom in on the ground, we can see it more clearly. On the right, you have lines of thread. I can reasonably talk about thread because that is what he is making.
Il l'a fait avant nous. Des lignes de fil bleu, c'est-à-dire cette...
In other words, creating a weft before the weaver's shuttle is passed through it. And then on the left, you have the truly woven part with its blue, yellow, red and black coloured squares.
Couleurs bleu, jaune, rouge et noir.
Looking at Landscape with Card, Deborah Silverman, the historian I spoke to you about earlier, sees blue threads in it, the same as the ones we have just seen before the shuttle is passed through.
Avant que la navette ne soit passée, elle considère que ces parties touffues.
She thinks that these dense, bushy sections in the foreground represent the weaver's skeins of wool. Notice that the view over the landscape narrows. If we imagine being a weaver sitting behind the loom, we would also have a view of the
Eh
fabric.
bien, on a une vue large du tissu et au fur et à mesure,
Wide at first, then increasingly narrowing as the fabric unfurls. We get the same impression following the edges of the fields. It is this painting in particular that aptly illustrates his work as a painter-weaver. Here are the skeins in the foreground. Then the coloured checks, like the Scottish plaids that he spoke to the artist Urrier about and whose disappearance he lamented.
regretter la disparition.
We have seen in this section a painter who became a weaver and a craftsman, who compared himself with the labourers who he had so admired in Newnan and whose work he emulated. After all, it was, at the time, a very respectable form of work, providing a means for the believer to express his faith in God and his confidence about being one of the elect. Van Gogh became a weaver. But the streets of Arles were not filled with weavers, but peasant farmers. So it's vital to understand how Van Gogh related to the local peasants and became a sower and ploughman, among others.
Quand vous regardez ce gros plan sur le tableau qu'on
When you look at this close-up of the painting we have just seen, you can sense how he moulded the paint, kneaded it, moved it around, and we might even say briefly that he laboured over it. On the subject of his potato eaters, he wrote, this time to Theo, that one would be wrong, to my mind, to give a peasant painting a certain conventional smoothness. I told you how he had a great deal of respect for work, and not for the desk-based work of a notary, but for vigorous, tiring manual work that he had known during his childhood among the peasant farmers, among his father's parishioners. He spoke an awful lot about paintings of peasants, often with nostalgia. If there was one thing that he detested, a rarity for Van Gogh, it was false paintings which he believed to have a conventional sweetness. That is to say, he detested paintings that lied. Without ever accusing him directly, because he respected the quality of his drawing, William Bouguereau represented this conventional, bland painter of insipid, pretty faces. When Bouguereau painted a peasant girl, she had a rosy porcelain complexion. Van Gogh criticised painters such as this for seeking academic figures, in other words, Greek statues, within these peasant girls. What he wanted was to depict the difficulty and the roughness of the work, and so conventional sweetness was rejected. If a peasant painting smells of bacon, smoke, potato steam, fine, that's not unhealthy. If a stable smells of manure, very well, that's what a stable's for. If the field has an odour of ripe wheat or potatoes, or of guano and manure, that's really healthy, particularly for city folk.
Cela est sain, surtout pour les citadins.
So he dreamed of educating these city folk, as I told you earlier on, because Dutch painting was there to teach a moral lesson. Depicting work is moral because it is, itself, a depiction of the elect's path to salvation. Van Gogh painted to the effect that viewers would learn something useful from his paintings. A painting of peasants shouldn't smell like perfume, and it shouldn't smell like academicism either.
Mais un tableau de paysan ne doit pas sentir le parfum, donc il ne doit pas sentir l'académicisme.
One of the painters that Van Gogh admired was a man named Léon Lermit. In a letter from 1885, he thanked his brother for having sent him some Lermits, the painter who he had discovered in the illustrated catalogue of the Salon in 1883. This work by Lermit is basically a second Millet. He admired his woodcutters, he admired swallows or gardening, and, fittingly, he admired ploughing.
Également, le laboureur, justement.
He said it himself, that Lermit was a second Millet, but his real benchmark was still Millet. Van Gogh discovered him in 1875. Millet died at the end of January 1875, and it so happened that in June, Van Gogh, who was an art dealer at the time, went to a drawing sale at Drouot that was primarily auctioning drawings by Millet. He proclaimed to have discovered a holy ground that radiated in its saintliness. It was the sacred character of Millet's rural realism that he admired. It was with him that Van Gogh learned to draw, not in the academies as I was saying to you earlier on. He was not built for the academy, which meant that in August 1880, when he started to learn how to draw, he asked his brother to send him work in the fields, which he copied by looking at the engraving, equipped with his pencil or charcoal.
C'est comme ça, en regardant la gravure et avec son crayon ou son fusain, qu'il va apprendre à dessiner.
He learned to draw and, in such a way, produced copies of Millet's engravings, one after the other. We have here Millet and Van Gogh's copy. Van Gogh also copied the woodcutters, so there are people praying in the middle of the fields among people digging and harvesting.
Qui prient en plein champ, il y a ceux qui bêchent,
Millet is on the left and Van Gogh's version is on the right, with people sewing. He will return to this sewer throughout his life, producing 5 versions during this period.
Il l'a fait à 5 reprises à cette époque.
However, the violence that we saw in Millet's drawing has disappeared. This is because the young Van Gogh was learning from Millet via his copying of the sewer.
Ce semeur qu'il admire particulièrement.
While we're at it, I'm going to show you 2 other sewers from 1882 because they have disappeared. So for the time being, you can no longer see them, or in any case, not the originals, in museums. Van Gogh then pursued his studies in the Brabant countryside where he sketched and drew from life, like this old man beside the fire, with its emphasis on the hands. He worked a great deal on the hands, because the hands of labourers are, in a way, the exterior sign of the goodness of their souls. He kept learning, improving and applying himself at Le Hay with this other, workman and woman with a wheelbarrow. He gained in self-confidence and wrote to his brother. In short, I think of the studies as seeds, and the more one sows, the more one may hope to reap. So he analysed himself again by drawing a comparison. He identified with these harvesters and farmers. It was he who sowed the seeds. He was the sower, and through his hard work he hoped to one day reap these seeds, his drawings and studies, and reimburse his brother thanks to the sale of his harvest, his paintings. So from the outset, and this text dates from 1882, he likened himself to a farmer. He drew an analogy with the wheat field and the sower. This time he was improving his paintings by reworking them in his own way. The silhouette of Millet's Gleaners was no longer a copy. It was not yet an interpretation, but he reworked the silhouette and especially magnified the shape of the hand. You also have women bent over digging and gathering carrots in the snow, as well as planting beetroots. The whole panoply of local culture is conveyed by Van Gogh's pen and drawing.
Et mise sous la plume et le dessin de Van Gogh.
At the end of his life, when he was in the asylum in 1889, his models could not be those who roamed the streets or landscapes he had previously depicted. He may well have chosen to sketch some of the patients, just as he had painted Dr. Ray during his stay at the hospital in Arles. But he certainly had with him, because in his letters he never asked his brother to send them back, Millet's engravings. So he had with him work in the fields and the 4 hours of the day that you can see here. He reworked all of these in 89. This was 8 years after his first sower. Based on Millet's work, Van Gogh had gone beyond learning by copying because he was producing real interpretations, even if he still considered himself an apprentice. He said in 89 that it had been nearly 10 years between 79 and 89, more or less, that he had been studying, given that it took 10 years for an artist to train. I will be this butterfly, ready to leave its cocoon, is the analogy he used.
En tout cas, l'analogie qu'il utilise.
So, let's have a look. You have a sower, the one from 81 that he copied and put into colour. We have Millet's Noonday Rest, and here is the colour version. The contrast of the complementary yellow and blue colours by Van Gogh also appeared in Woman Crushing Flax. You have the sheaf binder. Here it is in colour, and it is the same for the reaper with its extraordinary contrasting of complementary colours. And then it's the same in the spinner. While we're at it, once again we find a form of weaving on the floor of his spinner. This spinner is a reminder of his childhood, of the time when his father, as vicar and minister, looked after his parishioners by finding them winter work spinning wool.
De ses paroissiens en les faisant travailler l'hiver à filer la laine justement.
Now let's look at the wheat thresher. When you view Millet's thresher, the character stands out perfectly from the background through the chiaroscuro technique, which allows the figure to be detached from its surroundings. When we look at the copy on the right by Van Gogh, the use of colour changes everything. Interpretation here is the right word to use. Firstly, because he himself talked about interpretations in paint, but especially because the critic Octave Mirbeau said that we can no longer talk about copies and should instead discuss admirable works of interpretation. So, we sense the presence of the master painter Van Gogh, even if he would never consider himself a master. Where Gogh had an unbridled ego, this was not the case for Vincent. Let's zoom in. Look at how the orange strokes of the hay spill over onto his trousers and the blue of the sky overflows onto his shirt. We get the impression that his bushy hair is like clumps of hay. The figure of this farmer thrashes his wheat and grapples with the space in which he finds himself. There is a sort of fusion, in any case a grappling with the subject matter. Indeed, we find this same grappling with the subject matter in Van Gogh's work, when he depicts himself, as you will see in a moment. Van Gogh revisited Millet's Potato Eaters. It is the subject that you will know since he produced a painting of it, also named The Potato Eaters. What did he say about it? The colour they are painted now is something like the colour of a really dusty potato. He's talking about his painting. Unpeeled, of course. You can imagine that the farmer was grappling with his wheat, just as his painting grappled with the subject matter itself, with the potato. His painting is the dusty colour of a potato, unpeeled of course. While I was doing it, I thought again about what has so rightly been said of Millet's peasants. Actually, it was the critic, Alfred Sensier, who wrote this about Millet, proclaiming that his peasants seem to have been painted with the soil they sow. But Van Gogh didn't paint with rural soil, but with the dust from the very potatoes he depicted. He would curiously enter the tussle with this self-portrait that he produced in the spring of '86, so when he was already in Paris. Incidentally, there are touches of complementary colours that are beginning to appear with the use of green and red, with a touch of blue here and the orange there. He nevertheless painted himself in these potato colours again, because he had identified with and even become one of these farmers. He had become at one with the subject matter of his own paintings. Now for another self-portrait, the painter on his way to work. The quality of the image isn't perfect because the painting was destroyed in Magdeburg in 1845. The painting is also sometimes called The Painter on the Road to Tarascon. This is because Van Gogh had gone to the region of Tarascon, perhaps following in the footsteps of the novelist Alphonse Daudet. We recognise the artist as the subject of the painting. He very well might have used his perspective frame to compose the painting. If he did not, there are two trees that frame the image and a vanishing point at the top of his hat that would have worked to similar effect. What does he say about this self-portrait, given he doesn't know any other painters besides himself who depict themselves in their workplace? He says the following: "I am always dusty, always more laden, like a porcupine with sticks, easel, canvas, and other merchandise. Only the green eyes have remained the same, but another colour in the portrait, naturally, is a yellow straw hat, like a farm labourer." Farm labourer is a translation from the Dutch, taken from a letter to his sister, and not to Theo, to whom he still wrote in his native language. In his letter he spoke about Hanneke Meyer, referring to German seasonal farm labourers who came to work in the Dutch countryside. As we can see, he has a hat that protects him from the sun, like the humblest of peasant farmers. In this letter to his sister, he spoke about the hat that we also find in another self-portrait. His use of the sun hat was meant to mimic the peasant farmers from Arles. Thanks to another letter, we also know that he managed to paint when it was windy. Here is the letter in question, and I'm going to start at my easel. "My easel was fixed in the ground with iron pegs," he was addressing his friend, the painter Émile Bernard, "a method that I recommend to you." He continues by saying that you shove the feet of the easel in, and then you push a 50-centimetre long iron peg in beside them. I don't know if you realise this, but 50 centimetres is rather a lot. All the more so given that the ground at Arles must be really rather hard because it's so dry. He drove these pegs in 4 times, all 4 feet down. He continued, "You tie everything together with ropes, that way you can work in the wind." So he worked in the howling winds and in the stifling heat, perhaps not come hell or high water, but certainly in troubling conditions.
Il affronte les éléments, comme les paysans.
He braved the elements like the peasant farmers, and here he is, braving the toughest conditions and sharing the same conditions as the farmers he sketched and drew. But there is something else. Look at the position of the feet, legs and arms. It's that of an inverted sower. He depicted himself as a sower, as we might expect, given that he said earlier that he was sowing the seeds that one day would produce something he could reap. Therefore, he perceived himself as a peasant sower and depicts himself thus. In this painting of another sower, which dates from 1888, if I'm not mistaken, we find a sort of self-portrait. there is still this man sowing, and we recognize the posture of the sower. There is also an allusion to another sower that has since disappeared, which was itself adopted from a copy from 81. We find this same sower in the same posture, this time in a field, as is the case here. So perhaps he was indeed likening himself to these sowing and labouring peasant farmers. And besides, in a letter from 1885, he wrote the following: "I'll quietly keep my hand to my plough and cut my furrow." This comment puts one in mind of Reverend Petrus de Geneset's Protestant poetry. "Awake with the sun, stretch your hands to the plough in the great field." So there is a very sacred resonance for Van Gogh here, which returns to the Protestant poetry of his childhood. At the end of his life, he wrote, "My dear brother," he is in Saint-Remy, "I'm ploughing on like a man possessed," which is to say that he painted a huge amount. I won't say that he painted like a madman, because in the case of Van Gogh, the connotations bother me. He said, "I'm ploughing on," and indeed, if we zoom in on his painting, he ploughs the paint, he drives it, he stirs it, he kneads it.
Il la malaxe.
Here he is then, likening himself to a peasant farmer, with this sacred dimension that he attributed to manual labour.
Travail, comme je vous disais, mais également.
But it was also sacred because, having sown the seeds, he hoped that by labouring, he would one day be able to harvest a beautiful crop of paintings and pay his brother back.